You're listening to Climate Champions, a podcast from the Architects Journal. I'm Hattie Hartman, Sustainability Editor at the Architects Journal.
And I'm Hattie's co-host, Joe Williams, Head of Regenerative Strategy at Bywater.
This is the first of 3 episodes supported by Built by Nature, an Amsterdam-based nonprofit with a mission to lead a global transformation of the built environment by accelerating the responsible use of timber and bio-based materials. Built by Nature recently launched 5 principles for responsible timber construction, which to date have garnered close to 300 endorsements and will be presented at COP30 in Brazil shortly after we are recording this episode. The principles offer a really useful framework for thinking about how to use timber in the built environment without unintended consequences. Find out more at builtbn.org.
It's also worth thinking about where the timber's coming from. So what kind of tree are you using? What species? Where has it come from? Do you know where the forest is? Do you have any information on the forest, on the particular stand from the supplier? Sometimes this information can be really difficult to get hold of, but simply by asking it, I think we encourage our suppliers to think about it as well.
Today we're speaking to Joe Giddings, European Networks Lead at Built by Nature, just days after Built by Nature's annual summit, which was held at the Paradise Building, Field & Clegg Bradley's mass timber office building in Lambeth, South London. Over 400 cross-industry timber enthusiasts gathered from across the globe to hear the winners of Built by Nature's Global Prize for Sustainable Timber Construction present their projects, which ranged from Wall Thistleton's Black and White building in London to a CLT fire station in Queensland, Australia. The winning projects were judged against Built by Nature's recently released Principles for Responsible Timber Construction, which we'll talk more about in a moment. Founded in 2021, Built by Nature is an impact-driven organization that has rapidly become a leading voice in the discourse around building with timber. With a 17-strong team, Built by Nature is funding research to unlock barriers to timber construction and developing knowledge networks in the UK and across Europe to disseminate best practice. To date, it has funded over 40 research projects with 23 active grants at the moment. Prior to taking on the role of European Networks Lead in 2024, Joe Giddings set up and facilitated Built by Nature's UK network. After about a decade working as an architect both in Denmark and in the UK, he left architecture to move into advocacy roles, first directing the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products Timber Accelerator Hub, and then joining Built by Nature in 2022. Back in 2019, Joe was a co-founder of ACAN, the Architects Climate Action Network. I am indebted to Joe because it was at one of the early ACAN meetings that several people told me that we needed a good podcast, and hence with my first co-host, George Morgan, AJ Climate Champions was born. So Joe, we've come full circle, and it's great to have you as a guest on the podcast today.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with taking a close look at the principles for responsible timber construction.
Yeah, absolutely. So the principles for responsible timber construction are a global framework to ensure that an increase in demand for timber leads to positive outcomes for the climate, nature, and people. So there are a really simple series of principles that we think are needed to make sure that timber is used responsibly around the world. There are 5 principles, so I'll just run briefly through them now. The first of those principles is about extending the life of existing buildings. So always prioritizing an existing building, retaining over demolition. The second principle is about accounting for the whole life cycle. So thinking about the whole life cycle impacts and emissions of buildings and projects when you're designing or developing. The third principle is then about the forest itself. So making sure that we are ensuring sustainable forest management and sustainable forest management practices as well. This is particularly important, I think, when we're thinking about sourcing timber from parts of the world where certification is less prevalent. Much of the forest around the world is actually unmanaged. And so I think it's really, really important that we talk as much as we can about how to improve that situation. The fourth principle is about maximizing the carbon storage potential of wood. And I think probably many listeners, when I say that, they'll think I'm saying maximizing the amount of wood in a building. It's actually not about that at all. So maximizing the carbon storage potential of wood is making sure you're thinking about the lifespan of the product that you're using, making sure that timber is going into as long a lifespan product as possible when you're first using it, virgin wood from the forest. So timber structure is really, really good for that because it locks in carbon for the entire lifespan of the building. But then it's also about making sure that the carbon is then recycled into further lifespans after you take it out of the building, if you take it out of the building. So let's put some light on that. So a structural element could be used again when it's taken out of a building, could be used directly again in another building. If not, timber products can all be recycled into newer products. So a structural beam could be chipped up and made into OSB board or chipboard, for example, and then used again in a building for a very long length of time. Could be then downcycled again into fiber, become a fiber board, eventually becoming kind of paper, pulp, packaging. So there are many different life cycles that you can have with timber products before you get to the point where you actually have to burn it potentially at the end of its life. So that fourth principle is about making sure that you're maximizing that time the carbon is stored. And the fifth principle is about promoting timber building bioeconomy. So this is thinking about all the benefits to people and the economy all along the value chain, from the forest all the way to the building. There's nothing particularly radically new in these principles. But what they do is they bring together best practices into a framework within which we can feel much more confident that the use of timber is going to lead to positive outcomes at the global level.
I think that's one of the things I really like about the timber principles. They're so intelligible. It's 5 principles. They're really broad and they encompass, obviously, you spend a long time getting them down to those 5. But it's a really useful tool to understand what we should be looking for with timber. So it's a really nice sort of balance between complexity and sort of intelligibility. So whenever I'm thinking about timber, I'm thinking about FSC or PEFC or maybe grown in Britain or one of the other standards. Are they similar? Are they replacements? How do they sort of sit together?
I think what the principles do is, I suppose they act as more of an umbrella framework. So whilst those certification schemes tackle really important subjects about what happens at the forest level, the principles are really a framework to think about for all stakeholders along the value chain. So they're a bit broader. They encompass whole life carbon as well and carbon storage too. So it's really thinking much more holistically about the way that we demand timber actually and design with timber and specify it.
I agree that these principles are such a useful framework for stakeholders across the industry. Reading into them, it seems like there's a potential for a lot of exciting research to bolster them, to provide specifiers with the information they need. Can you tell us about some of the research Built by Nature is undertaking now, and particularly in relation to the principles?
Yes, I can. And in fact, there's a lot, because really the principles run through a lot of what Built by Nature funds. One of those is a piece of research we funded a couple of years ago, actually 2 separate pieces of research about construction stored carbon. So the carbon which is stored in timber. So timber approximately is usually about 50% carbon, there or thereabouts, depending on which species you're specifying. Until now, we haven't really valued that carbon stored in buildings in a particularly kind of clear or coherent way. But a few years ago, we funded 2 organizations separately. One of them was a Dutch foundation called Climate Cleanup, and the other was a Swiss organization called the Timber Finance Initiative. And both of them separately developed protocols for how to certify that carbon which is stored in timber in your building. This comes back to principle 4, which is about maximizing the carbon storage potential of wood. And we think that it's super important that this is done in a way which can be certified according to particular safeguards to ensure that we're counting it in the right way and then reporting it in the right way. Ultimately, those two grantees, Climate Cleanup and Timber Finance Initiative, are then looking at ways in which we can value that carbon. So could we create incentives around that stored carbon? So finance or policy, for example, that could then incentivize the use of timber.
Just on that, I think it's a really interesting approach to it, because not only does it bring finance into it and give it real value, but also it comes with a kind of verification and sort of extra weight that means that it is going to be stored. It's got processes that go with it. It's a really exciting idea.
It is. I agree. I think it could be a real game changer for bio-based materials more broadly, actually, because all bio-based materials have this ability to store carbon in buildings. And we're doing a lot of work about timber at the moment, but this could apply to hemp, straw, and others as well. There's a new piece of research as well, which I'm particularly excited about, which is being led by Thistleton and Adrian Campbell. For those that know him, they're a fantastic structural engineer. This research is called Using Wood Well. So what they are attempting to do is to look at two new metrics for using wood in buildings. So one of those is something called the use renewal ratio. So effectively thinking about the length of time a timber product or bio-based product is used in a building. So what's the lifespan of this element in the building? And then thinking about the replacement rate, so the growth cycle of that plant or that tree species. And then effectively, it's just a ratio of one over the other. So you can see whether or not the lifespan of the product that you're using outlasts the growth cycle of that particular plant. So let's think through an example. Spruce, which is commonly used for structure. Let's say the lifespan of that element is about 60 years in a building. Could be longer, but we assume it's around 60 years, which is just a bit longer than the growth cycle of spruce, which I think is between kind of 25 to 40 years, depending on when you harvest it. So that looks good because it means you're using the timber for longer than the tree was growing. This becomes really good, actually, the ratio when you're thinking about things like hemp, which has a really, really quick growth cycle, and you can then use it for insulation material within a wall that could sit there again for 50 to 60 years. As well as use renewal ratio, they're actually looking at wood use intensity. And this is a metric which shows how efficiently we're using timber in buildings. Wood use intensity basically just measures the volume of timber used per square meter of buildings.
I think they looked at that in the black and white building, Thistleton. Yeah. And yeah, it is a really good indicator.
Yeah. I really love the longevity one as well. I think that's fantastic. I think you could also extend it to sand or something. I seem to remember sand can take 40 million years to make. What's the design process to make your concrete last 40 million years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've heard a similar metric about clay as well. So we use bricks everywhere, right? In the UK, particularly here in London, and clay is around 40 million years as well, I heard, to form. Yeah. So thinking in those kinds of cycles, I think, is super important.
And how are the principles getting on? Are you getting a lot of traction?
Yeah, we are. So we're recording this podcast at the end of October. In a week's time, COP30 is kicking off in Brazil, in Belém. And there's lots of activity that we're planning around the principles at this COP. COP30 is particularly important because it takes place in an Amazonian state in Brazil. So it's the first time that one of the COP climate conferences has taken place within that kind of rainforest context, the Amazon specifically. So we think that forests are going to be front and center of conversation there. We've been gathering endorsements from industry as well as governments in the lead up to COP. So we've got around 280 organizations now that have endorsed the principles. And our hope is that in the long run, then that leads to policies and incentives being introduced by those national governments.
Excellent. And how are Built by Nature providing support for signatories? A lot of these initiatives fail because there isn't a lot of support. But I know Built by Nature, through its research, you provide guidance to go with it.
Yeah, so we're publishing a guidance report which is being written by Bauhaus Earth, which is effectively a guidance report about the principles themselves. What do they mean? Why are these principles important? And the second thing that we'll be launching is an implementation framework. So that's looking at all 5 principles and then highlighting resources, policies, tools, etc., that can be used or thought about by different actors along the value chain when they're developing a project. So that could be design guides or research outputs, that kind of thing. All of that will be available on our website.
That sounds really useful. That's great. So I want to turn to a couple of questions that are more focused towards what designers need to be thinking about. Timber supply chains are incredibly complex and global. How can designers use these principles to mitigate unintended consequences?
But I want to start by also saying that as a former architect, I'm also very aware about the level of detail and the depth at which you have to think about things as an architect. There are already so many frameworks that you have to think through. Thinking back to the 5 principles, the one that's particularly important, first and foremost, is thinking about the whole life cycle. I think in the UK, we're really quite advanced at this, and architects in the UK have been thinking about whole life carbon now for several years. But really, I suppose, making sure that if you're using timber, you're using it within a holistic strategy for minimizing whole life carbon emissions. So you're not just kind of using timber to make the project look good, but you're accounting for all of those impacts, including end of life, and really thinking quite deeply about what happens at the end of life of the building. And I think also important to say account for emissions and storage separately. I still see many projects that report whole life carbon with the storage, the biogenic storage actually subtracted from it. So it makes it look almost like a negative emissions building, which I think increasingly we're thinking is really bad practice, actually, because these are 2 separate carbon cycles and they should be treated as such. Emissions are always emissions.
I
So I
see
think
Joe nodding.
Yeah, it is one of those banes of my life. It masks the underlying issue. You're still emitting carbon. I think classifying them as 2 separate cycles is exactly that. I think this is the issue with it. We need to reduce carbon now, and we also need to store as much as we can. They're not the same thing. They're parallel exercises. Yeah, so I couldn't agree more, Joe.
What should project teams be asking a supplier?
it's super important that people seek environmental product declarations for the products themselves.
I remember when I had
EPDs.
the first piece in the AJ about environmental product declarations probably 15 years ago. Nobody had ever heard of an EPD, and it was like, why are we writing about this? So it's taken a while,
Yeah.
but
they continue to evolve as well, right? So companies change their EPDs. And I think the other thing worth noting is that generic EPDs often don't give you the right data. So it's something that I learned from, I think it was iStruct published a few years ago, a table which showed the global warming potential of different CLTs. And the difference between one CLT and another in terms of emissions is really quite vast. So I think it's super important to get the EPD for the specific product, because the emissions could differ greatly depending on where you're sourcing it from and the energy mix at the factory and all of that kind of thing. It's also worth thinking about where the timber's coming from, and more information should be available if you ask for it. So what kind of tree are you using? What species? Where has it come from? Do you know where the forest is? Do you have any information on the forest, on the particular stand from the supplier? Sometimes this information can be really difficult to get hold of, but simply by asking it, I think we encourage our suppliers to think about it as well. Jez Ralph at Evolving Forests, who is a fantastic advocate for sustainable forestry here in the UK. I heard him talking about how designers need to essentially switch to a more supply-led design. So thinking about what wood is available.
yeah, I really like that idea.
Yeah, exactly. And then thinking about what you could use locally and how you could use that in a building as well. So thinking much more deeply about how you're using wood.
It's not all about what's local, but it's about understanding that supply chain and what's abundant and therefore what's the right thing to use. I think it's a new skill for a lot of architects and designers. One of the things I'm really interested in, it's really timber specific, is forest management. How would a designer know what a good forest management scheme would look like? Is it as simple as, it's got an EPD, it's fine, or if it's FSC as a start point? It's kind of what's the low hanging fruit for it really as a design team? Where do they start from?
I don't know if it's that simple.
Oh, Joe, I thought you'd have a magic answer.
So the more that I've learned about biodiversity of forests, the more I've realized that actually it's not a very clear picture. There are some tropes that go around which are repeated often. So things like Sitka plantations are terrible for biodiversity is a view I think many hold. You have an image of a dark black forest where there's no life. But then you speak to people that deal with these kind of forests and you realize that actually they're one of the last strongholds for the red squirrel in the UK. So then the question is actually about what biodiversity is important. Are we talking purely about the number of species that a forest can hold, or are we talking about the diversity, or are we talking about the fact that they can harbour specific species? So a forest in Wales will have different species from a forest on the, let's say, northeast England. So I think it's really difficult to compare at the product or building level the biodiversity impact that you're having with specifying a certain material over another. Do you measure the forest as it was growing, or do you measure it after you've extracted the material? All of these questions are almost philosophical, I think, and they're too much, I think, for lots of us to think about. But I think that what's important is that the certification schemes like PEFC, FSC, grown in Britain, that they evolve to take into account this kind of thing. And as far as I'm aware, they are.
Jumping up a level, more strategic, is the objective of the principles to sort of challenge the systems that govern construction at the moment and think, how can this be changed? What are the pressure points where Built by Nature has some leverage? I guess by taking these principles to the COP and trying to push them at a global level. But then how does that get applied in practice to specific policy changes?
Let's take the UK as an example. In the UK, we have a Minister for Forestry, Mary Cray, who is going to be at COP as well. And we're hoping that the UK will be a endorser of the principles. And then let's think through how that could follow through into policy and practice and incentives. So in the UK, we have the Timber and Construction Roadmap, but then it's been picked up by the current government. And what that demonstrates is that DEFRA and other government departments are thinking about how to stimulate better kind of economy for timber. We've got lots of issues with certain regulations in the UK, but the government is actively trying to help the situation. And by endorsing the principles at COP, if the UK does that, then I think it gives us a commitment that we can then hold them to account over. So really, I suppose that's the main route to impact.
I mean, amazing amount of work. You talked a bit earlier about the circular economy aspects of it, and I think I go to a lot of conferences. I hear a lot of circular economy chat. I'm part of the circular economy group for SIPSI, and there's lots of really good stuff going on there. But it feels like we're not quite getting there. It feels like it's still a bit way off. I just wondered whether timber's an easier way into it compared to some of the materials. I'm just thinking about groups like Recollective and some of these amazing groups who are collecting timber from other places and really efficiently reusing it. Do you think timber's inherently more circular as a material, or is it more valuable? Or I don't know. I'd just be really interested to get your thoughts about how circular timber is, not just logs.
I think that timber, and in fact all bio-based materials, when thinking about circularity of them, they are inherently very different from other materials. And the key difference that I think is important is that they contain carbon. So they are carbon themselves. This means, I think, that circularity is even more important for timber and bio-based materials, because if you dispose of that carbon, it either decays or burns and escapes back to the atmosphere. So therefore, circularity for bio-based materials is fundamentally different from other materials and much more important. There is some progress being made, but I agree it's early. I want to give a shout out to Colin Rose. I don't know if you know him, but a fantastic researcher at UCL who's been, amongst other things, he's been taking old kind of Victorian roof trusses and turning them into CLT panels. But I think at a system level as well, there's quite a lot going on. So Kronospan are a big manufacturer of panel boards in Wales. They are rapidly increasing the amount of recycled content in both their OSB boards and their chip boards. Interestingly, that the reason I was told anyway that they're doing this is more so that they have a secure supply of wood, because they're looking at the supply that's coming from woodlands in the UK and the fact that there are many competing demands for that wood, increasing demand for that wood, and they want to make sure that they have a secure supply.
They do it because it's resilient and it's the right thing to do for their supply chain. That's what sustainability is really about, isn't it? It's about making and regenerative design, finding those little solutions. Brilliant.
So, Joe, you've mentioned bio-based materials, hemp and straw, but we don't hear much about other materials beyond timber. Where do these other materials sit in your work streams?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The reason that a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is about timber is because we recognize that starting with timber makes sense. It's the most common of these materials at the moment. It's the most available, and there's a lot of knowledge out there. So lots of our work, lots of our funded projects are to do with kind of mainstreaming timber. I mean, I actually think now, working across Europe with partners in 6 countries, I actually think that we're getting to the point where we can really consider timber a mainstream material. And many of the partners that we're working with around Europe are thinking much more holistically, actually, about a broader palette of bio-based materials, including hemp, including straw, but other plant-based fibers as well, such as rice or flax, or in other parts of the world, bamboo as well, which is of course very common and very quickly growing, very strong as well. So I think that our strategy was always to start with timber, and we're really in this for the long term. So if we're successful in kind of mainstreaming timber, we'll continue to then bring conversation and research around other bio-based materials in alongside that, where it's appropriate from country to country.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because I'm really keen to hear about what's happening, what you've learned from the networks that you're developing in other countries. And I think so far you're working in France and Spain and Germany and Italy. And tell us a bit about the drivers and policy initiatives and exemplar projects that you see happening. Who's leading the way?
We are working a lot with local networks, and what that means is that we're working together with industry organizations on the ground to try and identify country-specific challenges and barriers, and then solving them locally with local actors. Those are operating in 6 countries in Europe, so the UK, Netherlands, France and Germany, and then Spain and Italy as well, but also now East Africa as well. So we're working with a coalition of organizations in Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And that means we can share best practices from where it's going really well, and we can connect stakeholders between countries and develop pan-European solutions to some of these problems. We're working with partner organizations, and I thought, again, it would be worth giving a shout out to some of these partners because they're really interesting organizations. Bauhaus Earth, I've already talked about. We're working with an organization called BBCA in France, which is the Bâtiment Bas Carbone Association, so the Low Carbon Building Association. And they've been driving change in France over 10 years. They've played a really pivotal role in making sure that the carbon regulations in France are really far ahead and quite progressive. And then GBC Italia in Italy, and then Mass Madeira in Spain, which I was talking a bit about at the beginning. They operate out of the architecture school in Barcelona, EAC.
Fantastic. And are you managing to take lessons from one country to another and share it between the two or three or the burgeoning number?
In some cases, we are. The other thing to note is that the obstacles are actually very different from country to country. We've talked about insurance a lot in the UK over the last 3-4 years. But if you look at some of our other country networks, insurance is amongst the lowest ranked challenges in Germany, for example. So in some cases, I think we can share solutions across countries. The other thing that I've really enjoyed sharing are the case studies. So I've had the pleasure of traveling around Europe this year, and I've been blown away actually by the pace and scale of change across Europe, and it's no different here in the UK. So in London, when we had our summit 2 weeks ago, we took our front runners around 12 fantastic timber buildings in different parts of London. Stepping back and actually thinking about what we've achieved here in the UK as well is important, because I think we have come a long way.
I was surprised and heartened to see that on the short list for the Built by Nature Prize, there were actually 5 British projects. Where can people go to hear more about this?
I try to post as much as I can on LinkedIn about buildings when I go and visit them. And yeah, a particular standout from this year, I think, was a trip we made to Barcelona. What's happening in Barcelona is really fascinating, because the city, the Institute for Municipal Housing in Barcelona, has played a pivotal role in making sure that lots of social housing in Barcelona is now being built using timber. So you go there and you can see lots of examples of very low cost, very low carbon social housing that's being built all around the city. This includes well-known projects like La Balma, which is a cooperative housing, La Borda, another cooperative housing, and one particular one that we went to visit called Terraces for Life, or Terrazas para la Vida, by Urbanitary Architects, which is about 8-9 stories of social housing built from pine as well, which is perhaps quite unusual for many of our British listeners to hear. But why are there so many examples in Barcelona? Because the city's basically changed their tendering and procurement processes. They don't ask for timber when they tender for sites, but they prioritize quality of design, low carbon, speed of delivery, and they actually diminish the criteria of cost in their tendering process, because they want to focus on quality. So that whilst not asking for timber, they've ended up with a lot of timber social housing. Housing is really taking off in timber and bio-based as well. So one of the winners of our prize this year was a project in the Netherlands called Appleweg by architects called Moose. This is in the Netherlands, 63 apartments, again, social housing, very low cost, but high quality. And this has been built in Amsterdam. And the common thread there between Barcelona and Amsterdam is that the city has played a really driving role in making sure that more buildings are being built with low carbon materials. So whereas in Barcelona, it was tendering processes, in Amsterdam, the metropolitan region of Amsterdam has set this target for 20% of all new homes in the metropolitan region to be built using timber. Really ambitious, because they started from a point of 0.5% of homes, so something like that. So they've already jumped from 0.5% to 5%, and the target is now by 2030 to reach 20%. The role that cities can play is pivotal in making these kinds of projects. I also want to give a shout out to the role that other bio-based materials are playing across Europe as well. I see that straw is becoming increasingly common at kind of mind-blowing scales, actually. So in Sweden, there's a 12-story residential building which is being built with a timber structure and an external wall which is made from timber and straw. So it's an eco-cocoon straw panel system, which is cladding that building all the way up to 12 stories, which is I think just phenomenal. And the same e-cocoon product. It's then being used on a logistics center in the Netherlands, which is going to be completed next year. 150,000 square meters of logistics center clad in straw. So I think straw is coming up behind timber, I think, as an increasingly impactful bio-based material that we should be thinking more and more about as well.
Amazing. And is that because of the abundance and the cost and the time? Is it all of it?
Yeah, I think it's very abundant. It's a kind of agricultural byproduct, so it's available in most countries around Europe. It's also because of policy and regulation changing as well. So in France, for example, many listeners I think will know that they've got very progressive whole life carbon regulation. That regulation has led to an unbelievable pace of change in France, I think, and projects there are now using, yes, timber, but also clay, straw, hemp, all of these other products that are available as well. And we will see over the next 5 years all EU member states introduce similar regulation because the EU has now directed all of its members to do so. So I think over the next 5 to 10 years, the change will I suppose, expand from little pockets like Denmark and Sweden and France, where there's been lots of change. I think we'll begin to see progress all the way across Europe, and hopefully UK will catch up as well.
Tell us a little bit about Germany, because DRMM was named a Built by Nature frontrunner at your summit for the work that they've been supporting you through their office in Berlin.
DRMM have been really active across the UK and Germany as well. So they've got an office in Berlin, and talking to their director, Jonas Lenzer, actually is quite interesting because in the UK, they really struggle to use timber. But in Germany, every single one of their studios projects are built with timber. The proportion of buildings built with timber in Germany is much higher than the UK. I think it's kind of over 30% of all buildings are built using timber. So our network in Germany, which is led by Bauhaus Earth, is indeed looking at a broader palette of bio-based materials. They're also looking at hemp. They're looking at hempcrete and other natural materials like clay and earth. Also looking at paludiculture as well. Paludiculture is effectively like water-based plants, so reeds and things like that. Berlin is surrounded by low-lying, quite wet land, and so the crops that grow there are, of course, very, very, very different, and you can use the biomass from those crops. Germany is actually the biggest consumer of construction materials in Europe, and when deciding where to have networks, that was our main kind of criteria. So those 6 countries together is about 75% of material demand in Europe. The network's launched with a great group of frontrunners, includes DRMM, other architects like Saarbrück Hutton, a really, really great practice who are now building a lot of their projects from timber, and indeed won the German Architecture Prize this year, I think, for a project in Mannheim called Franklin Village, which you should check out.
Great. So interesting. Before starting the European networks, you were the UK networks lead for almost 3 years. Can you say a little bit more about how what's happening here compares to what you're seeing on the continent?
I think the first thing I noticed that's slightly different is the types of building that we're using timber and bio-based materials on or in. In the UK, it's more challenging to use timber and other bio-based on residential projects because we have, but what is being done quite a lot, things like offices, schools, educational buildings, and low-rise housing. I think we are seeing a massive uptick in at least timber. Developers like Bywater are increasingly thinking about a timber-led approach. We run this monthly developers forum. It also includes Related Argent and Lend-Lease and some other of these kind of big names. And all of them are really thinking about how to use timber on much more significant projects. So Landsec, for example, are about to complete on Timber Square in Southwark, which is 14 stories, and we're beginning to see timber being used on major projects in the commercial space. And I think that at the kind of low rise scale, it's becoming much more commonplace. So most of the major house builders in the UK, lots of them now even have their own factories where they make timber frame homes. We'll see that the percentage of homes that are built with timber will go up and up. We need to take a step forward and really think again much more holistically about the whole life carbon. That's the thing that we're still perhaps struggling with a bit in the UK, because we don't have any national regulation of embodied carbon.
I think people are nervous and a bit scared by this new idea of embodied carbon. But I think once they start to get into the idea of it, they'll see the benefits, much like you described in Barcelona, that actually it's just a better way to do things. It's quicker, it tends to be cheaper in the long run, it's less invasive, it's less air pollution when you build it, all of these kind of co-benefits. This is why it's really good having that developer forum, which we sit as part of. It's great to hear those stories, and we share these stories in a kind of non-competitive way.
One more general question. How does Built by Nature go about measuring its impact?
In terms of actually measuring metrics, we do a study with our frontrunner network. So across all 6 countries, we have about 145 companies now that are part of our frontrunner network. So we ask our frontrunners to rank the impact of different barriers and challenges. Insurance is among them, fire safety, but it's a list of 10 different challenges. And we're tracking the impact of those challenges year on year. So within our group of frontrunners, we can see what's becoming more challenging, what's becoming less challenging. And then, of course, we know where to focus our support.
We need to wrap up. I wanted to ask you a couple of more personal questions. So what prompted your decision to leave architecture in 2021 after about a decade of working as an architect?
I'm very conscious that lots of architects will be listening to this, so don't want to talk down architecture too much, but I found that personally, I wanted to work on more system level kind of change. And specifically in 2019, climate was rising quickly up the agenda. And this really prompted me to think much more deeply about the work that I was doing. I suppose made me realize that whilst I can have agency as an architect at a project level, lots of the things that were stopping me having an impact were more systemic. And so I wanted to move sideways from practicing as an architect to, trying to work on some of these more kind of system level changes. And that kind of led me to, with a group of others, set up the Architects Climate Action Network on the side of work. So whilst I was still practicing.
I saw that after you finished your part 1 at Oxford Brookes, you went to study at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen. And your master's thesis was about political architecture and critical sustainability. So tell us a little bit what that was all about.
So it's a course at KADK in Copenhagen called Political Architecture, Critical Sustainability. And this course stood out to me because it was about thinking about architecture, not just in terms of, I suppose, like the form, the materials, the space, but thinking about how that building then embodies certain kind of politics. So it's really thinking about architecture as being fundamentally political. It was a fascinating course, and it really got me thinking, I suppose, more deeply about buildings and space and cities as well.
So one last question. With the summit behind you, what's on the agenda now for 2026?
So I'll personally be focusing on our European network. So next year, we'll be going much deeper with these networks and really trying to make sure that we're sharing knowledge between them and that we're identifying and hopefully overcoming some of the challenges on the ground around Europe. And of course, we'll be continuing to work on the principles and the next level of the principles framework, which is about how to apply these principles in practice in projects as well. So that will continue to be a focus for us in 2026.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks for having me on.
Our next guest will be Kirsten Haggard, Associate Director and Head of Research at Waugh Thistleton Architects. This episode is supported by Built by Nature, an Amsterdam-based nonprofit with a mission to lead a global transformation of the built environment by accelerating the responsible use of timber and bio-based materials. Built by Nature recently launched 5 principles for responsible timber construction. The principles offer a really useful framework for thinking about how to use timber in the built environment without unintended consequences. Find out more at builtbn.org.